Make sure your insurance doesn't come up short. Get gap cover with ALA. For more information, follow the links in the description. Hello everybody. In 1970, Nissan sold just 2,000 cars in the United Kingdom. Come 2024, not a spectacular year for the firm, and they shifted 100,000 of them. And this is a common theme. A great many companies that in the 60s were almost non-existent, now some of the biggest in the world. And in today's episode, I'd like to share with you one particular article that I found while I was researching this car, the Datsun 240Z, because I felt it was one of the most insightful and interesting pieces of journalism I have ever seen. And today, 5.5 decades later, it shows us that all that time ago, the Japanese knew something that we didn't. Gorgeous, isn't it? I'm very grateful to Nissan for lending me their very own Datsun 240Z for the week. It's been an absolutely incredible experience to live with this iconic sports car. Now this is a very, very important car too, because it was the first of the Z cars, a lineage that now stretches back over 56 years. In fact, even today, in the car called simply the Nissan Z, which many refer to as the 400, you can see more than a little bit of influence from this. A car that first appeared back in 1969. Now here's the thing. When I make these videos, sometimes researching is a lot harder than you might think. There's often this belief that on the internet you will find everything. And over the years, I've come to realize that's simply not true. More than that, even if you do find something, you have to ask yourself how true it is, what the source is, and whether you can believe it or not. And though I know in some cases that might sound like some big, grand political statement, actually for what I do, it's much, much simpler than that. When I'm reviewing old cars like this, something that's really important to know is how much it cost when it was new. Don't believe me? Try it for yourself. Just think of any car from the 80s, 90s or noughties and just try and find out how much it cost when it was new. I guarantee you'll be able to find out what one costs now. You might find some buyer's guides from 10 or 15 years ago telling you what it cost then, but if you want to know what a car's actual rival was back in the day, it's weirdly difficult. And so, I decided a while ago to start buying old issues of Autocar, because it's a periodical that has been running for over a century now. It is basically the original car mag, and without a doubt, the most important part of many Autocar magazines for me is the new price segment, in which they do exactly what you might imagine. They have a list of all the cars on sale in Britain at the time and their new price. And if it's an old issue, they'll tell you what it cost if you wanted an automatic gearbox or not. And this is very handy because it tells me that if someone were looking at buying one of these, what could they have had for the same money back in the day? But when it came to the Datsun, I wanted to know a little bit more than that. You see, today we all know how important this car was, not just in terms of Nissan, but in perception of the Japanese car industry as a whole. This is one of the earliest examples of a Japanese sports car that did well in the export market. And so I wanted to know if people back in the day felt that way, or if they thought it was simply going to be a bit of a flash in the pan thing. And that led me to this, the 6th of May 1971 issue of Autocar, yours for 12.5 pence. On the front, you'll see a picture of a beautiful Datsun, which looks to be in a kind of red pinky shade, though that might be either the scanner that they used for it or my printer. In this issue, you have a Morris Marina 1800 and Hillman Hunter double test, a road test of the Renault 16 automatic, and a guide on economy driving. Along with that though, you've got a special 10-page supplement on Datsun Today, where they visit Japan. Back in 1971, that must have felt like a trip to Mars. Now, what I went looking for was simply a review of this car. I just wanted to know if they thought it was any good, whether they thought it was going to do well, and if they thought there was anything particularly interesting about it being Japanese. What I found instead was just a fascinating look into the 1970s and the beginnings of an industry that was then going to dominate the world. And looking at it now, it's fascinating because you can see here all the signs of what was going on, and yet I can't help but wonder if we in Britain were, I don't know, ignorant of what was about to happen. So I'll give you some of the highlights. I shan't read you the entire thing. If you would like to, either buy a copy of this on eBay or subscribe to Autocar, where they have a couple of options, including one that gives you access to the entire Autocar library. For petrolhead geeks like me, it's money very well worth spending. This article, written by J.R. Daniels BSc, opens with a fairly big and important statement. The fact that Datsun were now the world's 7th biggest car maker. And in case you were wondering, you had General Motors at the top, then American Ford, VW, Toyota, Chrysler, Fiat, and finally Datsun. Toyota and Datsun being by far the biggest of the Japanese car makers. Curiously here, they go and mention Mazda and Mitsubishi, but Honda are absent. But in spite of Toyota having a larger global share, it was actually Datsun which was the UK's most successful Japanese car brand. And to be perfectly honest with all of you, for me, one of the biggest revelations actually comes on the front page. In a small, it is the caption for a photograph of the Datsun production line. And it says, work on the Datsun 1600 production line, compared with an average British plant, the use of sophisticated power tools is limited. Workers are spread at far greater intervals, and component delivery systems are fairly basic. In other words, the Japanese factories weren't as good as ours. Some more numbers for you. Datsun did very well in 1970. Taking car production alone, which in Japan can be a little bit confused because of the varying ways they categorize things, their output was up 30% against Toyota's 11%. Home sales being up 16%, again against Toyota doing 11%. The big deal here being that Datsun were the company whose exports were growing faster than any others. And this is very important because here they state that in the home market, they felt that things were slowly becoming saturated. Japan took a long time to rebuild after the war, and they state here that the country's roads were still in an awful state. In fact, there were more trucks on them than there were cars. Such was the state of things at the beginning of the 1970s. However, by this point, people were starting to buy cars, but it had now got to the point where they felt like most of the people who were going to buy a car probably already had one. It also states that Datsun felt they didn't want to get involved in the 360cc class, what we today would call a K car, that actually being really the precursor of the modern day K. Though they do go to pains to point out that one thing which might also be hampering the expansion of the car in Japan is the fact that their public transport is excellent. However, regardless, in the end of 1970, there was something of a contraction in domestic sales. This, they point out, is something that European manufacturers had already become familiar with, but the Japanese, by virtue of having a much younger industry, just weren't so used to dealing with. What they actually state is one of the biggest issues they were dealing with is with the road network in the country being so difficult, logistics were very tricky. And so manufacturers wanted to make sure they didn't have to transport too much across a large distance, because this would really hamper your ability to up your production. Now, of course, for my younger viewers, you might already be a little bit confused about the Datsun name. Older viewers, I'm sure, are already very familiar with it. For reasons that, to be honest, are many, they didn't use the Nissan branding here for a little while. Instead, we were sold cars as Datsuns. Nissan, they got in the home market, and shortly before this article was written, they had also acquired the Prince Car Company, which came with a few different things, including a car that we'd know as the Skyline. The article states here how now with the different brands they had, they were trying to build a whole range of cars, everything from 1 litre up to about 4 litre, with fairly consistent intervals from 1 to 2.4, and then either a 3 or 4 litre for their bigger model, which here they already called the President, something they actually used for quite some time after. Another point of interest for engineering geeks is that here it would appear Datsun were a little bit forward-thinking, because when it came to development of their new entry-level 1000cc model, Datsun went with the then still relatively new transverse engine front-wheel drive layout. Toyota, meanwhile, sticking with a more conventional setup. That, in case you're wondering, was for the Cherry, which I don't believe was called that here at the time. Now we get into the meaty and I think really interesting stuff, where you get a real insight into the way that these people were thinking. Because it says here, it was refreshing to talk to Japanese engineers on their home ground, because they found them to be remarkably uninhibited. It said, yes, they had looked at all of the existing front-wheel drive designs, but the Fiat 128 came out after the Cherry's design had been frozen. And they said that they actually felt that the road noise in the Cherry wasn't well insulated, where the road tester here said he thought it was actually okay. They said, no, we can do better. They go to pains to mention how they felt that the gear change in the Cherry was better than any other car of equivalent type. This is because the Japanese had spent quite some time making sure that it had worked and developed engineering solutions to make sure their gear change was the best. And here we have, I think, one of the killing blows. They point out that in recent Japanese export cars, road testers here had felt that the brakes weren't quite good enough and the dampers also were not very well regarded. Nissan stated they'd already made sure that the brakes in the Cherry were much better than in cars before. And here, the guys that were sent over were asked directly, what about our dampers isn't good enough? You tell us what we need to do and we're going to do it. It seems so painfully simple, doesn't it? Ask the experts, ask the people driving the cars and telling others whether to buy them or not, what you don't like about it and how it can be fixed. And then they fixed it. In fact, this car here, the 240Z, wasn't really built for the Japanese. Instead, it was built for us, the export market. This was the car that they sent out, knowing that at home it probably wasn't going to do that well, maybe just because people didn't have enough money. However, abroad, they knew they did, and they had an appetite for this kind of thing. They'd been watching, learning, listening, and said, okay, we see you like sporty cars. Here's our take on it. And when they delivered it, it was brilliant. Here we then have a feature about the expansion of Datsun in Britain, led by a man called John Pinkerton, an Australian who knew the Japanese cars from his time in Oz and then brought that here to help the brand expand. They worked very, very closely with the factory to make sure that not only were the dealers supported, there were plenty of them, and so anybody buying themselves a Datsun would find they could get spare parts in good time. If there was an issue, it could be solved, that the people were trained to work on the cars. They knew they couldn't just ship a bunch of cars over and let them take care of themselves. It's fantastic, fascinating reading. And then we have the review of this, which does extraordinarily well. Prices tested £2,288.33. It'll do 125 mile an hour, 0 to 60 in 8 seconds, and do 24 mpg. They tested it against things like the Mercedes 280 SL, the Porsche 911T, the Triumph TR6, and it was faster than all of them. In fact, just about the only thing quicker was the Jaguar E-Type with its 4.2. That's it. And that was more money. And you know what's amazing? They even point out in this very issue that the Japanese motorcycle industry had already taken over in the decade before. And yet, it would seem people couldn't see that the car industry was about to do exactly the same thing. I'm reminded of a great story that I saw told in a documentary that I have never been able to find, so if you can, please do tell me where I can get a copy of it. And I'm probably going to make some mistakes here, but the bones of it are going to be accurate. It was told by Murray Walker, and he recalls as a much younger man being at the Isle of Man TT in the 1950s. And a team of Japanese gentlemen had come over who everybody suspected were from Honda. Now, at the time, anti-Japanese sentiment was still very strong, the war very much still a recent memory, and so nobody really went and spoke to them. They left them to their own devices. They were there with many cameras taking photographs of all of the British bikes of the day, which at that point in time were the best in the world. Your Triumphs, Nortons, BSAs, so on and so forth. And they took a lot of time, looked at all these bikes, and then they went away. The next year, nobody heard from them. The year after, they announced their entry, and everybody thought the same thing. The Japanese are going to turn up with a copy of a 2-year-old Triumph. And then, when they arrived, what they instead unveiled was half the weight, more powerful, more agile, better built, and just blew the British competition away. The Japanese had looked at everything that we were doing and went, we can do that a hell of a lot better. And they did. And this is the nature of development. Look at any motorsport. There'll always be one team that does really, really well for a while, and then another will come along. The important thing, if you want to survive, is go, okay, all right, they're beating us now. How do we get them back? The British motorcycle industry instead went, who's going to buy these silly, silly Japanese things? Lots and lots of racial slurs used at the same time as well. And they just thought, you know what? They'll be a flash in the pan. No one's going to want them. They'll come back to us. They'll come back to good old British beef. But we didn't. We bought Japanese bikes because they were better. Better built, better handling, faster, and better value. Why would you buy a British bike? If you were going to do it for any reason other than the totally illogical, some sort of fascination with British bikes, you'd go Japanese. This happened. In the 1960s, Honda went from basically a company that some people had heard of to probably one of the most successful on two wheels. The car industry was about to go through the same thing. And yet, we were too busy fighting with ourselves to notice. They mention unions in here. In Japan, they did it a different way. You see, here we had unions based on trade. You'd have the union of metal workers, the union of panel pressers, the union of miserable bastards. In Japan, they had unions based on the company. So you'd have the Nissan union, you'd have the Toyota union, etc., etc. And that meant that because the factory over the road was treating its workers poorly, it wasn't really a problem for you, because if you were being treated right, you kept working. And so the factories kept operating. And there was also a very cultural thing of Japanese workers caring about the quality of the product they were making. In Britain, we seem to care more about when the next tea break was. And as a result of that, and a great many other things, we lost our industry. And the sad thing is that this article proves you could see it coming from a mile away. Just ask yourself, if they had factories that are worse than ours, if they had roads that are worse than ours, if they had lower wages than ours, and they were still building better cars, well, the fault there, that's ours too. There you go. I hope you've enjoyed today's rather different video. I found that fascinating, and with luck, so did you. I want to say a big thank you to Nissan for lending me this beautiful Datsun 240Z, and to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.